Good morning, everyone. My name is Praveen Sinha, and I'm here on behalf of Indian Americans of Irvine and Orange County. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Lance Izumi, who will be talking to us about Proposition 16. Mr. Izumi is a lawyer by training and has extensive experience in education, civil rights, and policymaking. He's currently Senior Director at the Center for Education at Pacific Research Institute. From 2015 to 2018, he chaired the board of directors of the Foundation of California Community Colleges and still is a member of that nonprofit that supports community colleges. From 2004 till 2015, he served as a member of the board of governors of the community colleges. He has also served as commissioner of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, and he was also a member of the Civil Rights Commission's California Advisory Committee. So welcome, Mr. Izumi. Would you like to say a few words before we get started?
I appreciate you reaching out to me, and I hope that we can have a good conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that Mr. Izumi was also part of the Reagan administration, so I don't want to make you feel that you're old, but it was a very important administration, and you had a very important role to play in there too, as a staff member at that time. So I want to recognize that you were part of the Attorney General's office at that time. Okay, so let's start with the questions, and let's go through them one by one. Now, we are all seeing so many propositions on the ballot these days. So let's get a little bit of civics knowledge out of the way. How do we get a proposition on the ballot? What are the mechanisms by which one can put them there? And if you can elaborate that a little bit so that we can get a sense of what kind of source is this particular Proposition 16 that we're looking at?
Well, there are two basic ways where something can get on the ballot as a ballot measure. You can either have a citizen initiative where, many people are familiar with that, where people have to gather signatures to put something on the ballot. Now, it really depends whether you're going to change, let's say, a state statute, a state law that has been passed by the state legislature. If you are trying to change something like that, then you have to get a little over 600,000 or so signatures on a ballot for a ballot measure to be put on the next election. If you're trying to change something, let's say in the state constitution, however, the bar is set higher. So the number of signatures you have to get is close to 1 million actually right now. And so that's a steeper hill to climb. Now, the state legislature, of course, since they can pass the laws, I mean, they can simply pass a law and change whatever laws are in existence at the time. But in order to change the state constitution, if the state legislature wants to do that, then each house of the state legislature has to pass a bill by 2/3 majority, and both in the state assembly and in the state senate, and it will go on to the ballot. Now, interestingly enough, if the state legislature passes such a constitutional amendment change, then it does not need the signature of the governor. It simply goes right on the ballot. And so now that doesn't mean, of course, that obviously that whatever is in the Constitution is automatically changed. It now goes to a vote of the people. And that's what we have here right now with Proposition 16. We have the state assembly and the state senate passing what at that time was Assembly Constitutional Amendment number 5 out of the state legislature. And it has now become Proposition 16, which would repeal Proposition 209, which was passed back in 1996.
Okay, so this is a pretty high bar. 2/3 of the votes is very difficult to get, and I think at this time our California, both the houses, Assembly and Senate, are quite heavily dominated with Democrats. Is it a partisan initiative totally, or is it bipartisan? That will help people understand better.
Well, it's like I think it's virtually party line. what the change, let's say, between now and back, let's say 1996, is the composition of the legislature. So back in the 1990s, it was a much more evenly split legislature. I mean, there were even times in the late 1990s where the Republicans, for example, controlled the state assembly. But now you have super majorities of Democrats who control both houses of the legislature. And by super majority, that means that they have more than a 2/3 majority, which means that just on a party line vote, they could pass something like ACA 5, which would therefore become Proposition 16. And that's basically what happened.
Since Prop 16 will repeal 209, can you give us a brief sense of what Prop 209 is all about and the background that led to its passage?
Let me just mention that in terms of like what 209 actually says. Basically what Proposition 209 says is it takes the language from the 1964 United States Civil Rights Act and basically puts it into a state constitutional amendment. And so what the Proposition 209, its main clause says is that the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public contracting, and public education. And so therefore it's, I mean, that language is almost verbatim from the 64 Civil Rights Act that was passed by Congress. And so, so that is the language of Proposition 209, which Proposition 16 is attempting to repeal. And so the people who were behind Proposition 209 back in 1996, the proposition was actually written by a couple of academics, university academics, a professor named Glenn Custard and Tom Wood. And so they actually wrote it. But people who do remember Proposition 209, at least the campaign for it, probably remember that the person who was heavily involved in its passage was a UC regent at the time named Ward Connerly. And Mr. Connerly had been an appointee of Governor Pete Wilson and was very influential on the UC Board of Regents. And he was the one who in 1995, a year before Proposition 209 was eventually passed by 55% of the vote, in 1995, the year previously, Ward Connerly had put up a proposal before the UC Board of Regents that called SP1, which repealed, which eliminated the use of race in the consideration of admissions. And so it was to go to a race-neutral admission system. And that policy, SP1, passed the UC Board of Regents prior to Proposition 209 passing in 1996.
I just want to clarify one thing here for the audiences who may not know. Ward Connerly is actually an African-American leader, a very authoritative person on civil rights and related matters. And even today, he is against Prop 16, and he was the biggest proponent of Prop 209 at that time. Is that correct, Mr. Lance?
That's correct, Professor. And I think it's important not only to mention that, you know, Mr. Connerly is African American and continues to be very heavily focused on civil rights issues, but also too that there are other members, minority members of the UC Board of Regents who voted to pass this policy. So, for example, a person who was actually a good friend of mine, Stephen Nakashima, who was one of the Asian American members of the UC Board of Regents, very influential Asian American member at the time, he voted in favor of going to a race-neutral admission system. And you know, he cited his experience as being interned during World War II in one of the Japanese American internment camps to say that, you know, when it comes to race preferences, people, if you're looking outside the barbed wire, you know, then it looks not so bad. But if you're looking from behind the barbed wire, then it's a pretty bad thing. And so So it was not just Ward Connolly, but it was other minority members of the UC board that also supported this change.
So let me just rephrase it. So it is fair to say that 209 has bipartisan, biracial, it had a pretty broad support all over California when it was passed in 209 in 1996.
Yes, no, that's correct.
Right. So we have come a long way from that, from having a broad support to something which is now narrowly along party lines, and that's apparently a big shame, I would say. But I think that's where we are at this time.
Yeah.
I remember even during Reagan administration, which you were part of, things, important matters were not measured around along party lines. But right now we are living in very different times. So thanks for clarifying that part. So let me just get one more thing from you clarified, that this civil rights movement affirmative action is not too far off from the Proposition 209 that was passed. Or are there any differences? Can you clarify that part, the affirmative action law that was passed versus Proposition 209? I think you've already answered it. I just want to make sure I get that clarified one more time.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question, Professor. I mean, we do need to understand the background, not just of Proposition 209, but also of the 1964 U.S. Civil Rights Act. If you look at the immediate years preceding the passage of the 64 Civil Rights Act, what was happening in America in the early 60s, you had a lot of the civil rights protests that were going on, the marches that were going on, especially throughout the South. And one of the major moments in American history, certainly in the civil rights movement, was the peaceful demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, where unfortunately the demonstrators, the African American demonstrators, had police come in and break up violently their demonstration, which became a huge iconic moment in U.S. history. And so that was why, one of the reasons why President Kennedy, when he pushed for the U.S. Civil Rights Act, which actually they put together in 1963, the year before it was eventually passed by Congress, President Kennedy, when he would go out and speak before the American people, put the argument in favor of passing this Civil Rights Act as a moral issue for the American people. That America, is a country that has great constitutional principles, but it has those constitutional principles, according to President Kennedy, had to be applied in a manner which was race neutral, which was colorblind, and that only when those principles were applied in that way could we feel as though we really have equal protection under the law, and that all people are created equal. And so he put that moral case to the American people. In 1964, that moral case was strong enough to get a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans to pass the Civil Rights Act. And in fact, it was the first Civil Rights Act since the Civil War that was passed by Congress.
So my next question is a little hypothetical, so feel free to go whichever directions you want to go in. If Proposition 16 passes, will the history repeat itself?
Well,
in the sense that will we start having discrimination again? And if so, can you elaborate what kind of discrimination we might see?
Well, I think it's highly likely, actually. I mean, I think there are two parts to answer that question, Professor. And the first part is to look back at what was the state of affairs prior to the passage of Proposition 209 in 1996. And if you go back into, let's say, the early 1990s and look at how, for example, the University of California admitted students into its system, it was very much a race-conscious system of admissions. And so my institute, actually the Pacific Research Institute, way back then in the mid-1990s, actually did a study where we looked at, where we used University of California data to look at the admissions rates at University of California medical schools. And what we found was pretty amazing. So that you found that let's say, Japanese Americans and Korean Americans were admitted into the medical school at UC Davis at 13 to 14 times lower a rate than those for members of so-called underrepresented minority groups. And so therefore, it was a huge difference. And it was actually shockingly so. In fact, while underrepresented minority groups were being admitted in, like, for example, dozens into the medical school at UC Davis, like out of 90 applicants of Japanese Americans, only one was actually admitted, which is like an incredible statistic. And that held throughout, the various medical schools that we looked at. And I think one of the other things that was, sad and shocking was that you looked, for example, at Vietnamese Americans, who, as you might remember, back in the early 1990s, were certainly very new to this country. And so if you looked at the Vietnamese American graduates from UC Irvine, for example, that they, as a group, actually had the highest GPA of any of the various groups, ethnic groups. And yet, when it came to admissions into UC medical schools, like they were admitted at far lower rate than members of other minority groups. And what was interesting is that those Vietnamese Americans who had been rejected actually had higher GPAs than those individuals from underrepresented minority groups, or at least a large percentage of them, who were from these underrepresented groups. So, it was very disturbing to see that, especially with a group that had been impoverished, had suffered so much as being refugees coming over to the United States, and yet having this opportunity to them to, for success in life, to be closed off to them. And so that's what the situation was prior to. I think that one of the things that we have to look at, at Prop 16 and the possibility of what would happen after that is that, you would probably end up going back to that old system where, race would be injected into the admissions process. But then you have to ask, well, in this day and age, how much difference would that make? And I think that one of the things that we can look at is look at some of the legal cases that are going on around the country. For example, at Harvard and Yale. Yale, for example, the U.S. Department of Justice has just filed a complaint against Yale, saying that they have been racially discriminating against Asian Americans in their admissions process, and that looking over an almost 20-year period from 2000 to 2017, that you find that Asian Americans had anywhere from like 1/10 to 1/4 the chance of admission into Yale, and in terms of a rate, versus those from underrepresented groups. And so Harvard, for example, there's been a whole legal case that's been going on since 2000 and I think it was 18. So no, I think 2016, 18, around there, where a lawsuit was filed against Harvard's admission system. And even Harvard's own research data shows that if, for example, Asian Americans were admitted solely on merit and academic factors, that they would probably end up being admitted at probably around a 40 to 43% rate. And yet they are only admitted at less than a 20% rate.
I was looking at the data for UC Berkeley and the UC system admissions for this year. They got rid of SAT requirement. And there was a huge jump in enrollment for several minority groups. And the Asian groups were definitely down. What do you think will happen once we pass this Proposition 16? I have a sense, and you can correct me if I'm wrong and give your input into it. Are we going to expect things to get even worse now? Because they've already done a pretty major damage to the admissions process this year.
Yes, no, I think it's, you have to look at Proposition 16, in conjunction with what the University of California system has done by dropping its testing requirements. And so, testing is like one of, and grades, high school grades are, one of the two major academic factors that you use in admitting people into the UC system. The Academic Senate for the University of California issued a report earlier this year that showed that the combination of the test scores and students' test scores and their GPAs were really the best predictors of how that student was going to do once they got into the University of California. If you take away that testing requirement, then what are you left with? You're left only with the grade point average. And unfortunately, as we all know, grade point average has been inflated over the years. It's not, there's no real uniformity in terms of how kids are graded from school to school. So it's a very, to me, a very uneven indicator of a student's grade points, academic performance level.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a problem. But I think also too that, you hit the nail on the head, Professor, when you mentioned the problem of equality of opportunity versus equality of result. And I think that if we want to have equality of result, and well, either equality of opportunity and result, what we have to look at is why are we having this issue about trying to have more students from underrepresented minorities attending the University of California? I mean, if that's our goal, that we want to increase that, then we have to look at what the cause is. And the cause is not that there's this admission system that is biased against them. Even the University of California president, Janet Napolitano, who actually supports Proposition 16, admitted that the reason why students from underrepresented minorities are not coming into the system at greater numbers is because they're not taking the college preparatory courses that they're required to take in high school in order to be eligible for UC consideration. So if you look at the percentage of African Americans and Hispanics who are taking the so-called A through G courses that are required to be considered for UC admissions, you have about 40%. And when you compare that, let's say, with Asian Americans, you have about 75% of Asian Americans who are taking those courses. So really, if you want to increase the pool of people from underrepresented minorities who are able to then enter the UC system, you need to do something at the K-12 level to prepare the kids to be eligible for admissions.
Yeah, and that's a can of worms nobody wants to touch. One thing I saw, and I had no idea about what to make out of it, but there were a couple of news articles that came out which said that Prop 16, yes, and Prop 16 will benefit women. And I was a little bit surprised, but I want to know what is your take on it? Because especially in the context of colleges, I think the split of female-male admission is more in favor of women, not unfavorable to them. So where this could be coming from, if you can, comment on that question, because I think there are a lot of women here, and this question is important for them.
No, I think you alluded to it, Professor, because if you look at the current enrollment, undergraduate enrollment in the University of California system, there's a 9 to 10% advantage to women in terms of, versus men. So that about 54 to 55% of UC undergraduate enrollment is women, and only 45% or so of undergraduate enrollment is male. So if you're looking at going back to a time of equality of outcome, as you mentioned, equality of results or proportional representation, however you want to call it, then it's possible that women could suffer because of that if we go back to any kind of gender balancing.
Right. Because I think women have made a very significant progress purely on merit. They've competed heavily. The girls have performed very well in high school, and that is the reason they're in two top schools. If you start putting this equality of outcomes based or a desirable demographic outcome, it may It may very well hurt women rather than help. That was my take. But maybe there are two other areas this proposition will affect other than college admissions. And if you can briefly allude on that as well, state contracting and public employment. I don't have much sense on that. And most of the audiences we have here are also concerned about college admissions. But I'm sure the small businesses we have will be contracting with the government and they will be affected and they may not even know that. So can you just give me some sense of that if you have any insights into that? Because I know that's not your area of expertise, but whatever you know that will be helpful to us.
Right. Well, I think that one of the things that we can say is that if Proposition 209, when it was passed back in 1996, if it was going to have this negative impact on all these different areas, let's say, higher education, enrollment, public employment, public contracting, you probably would see a lot different picture, than the reality that we actually see right now. So let's take public employment. And if you look at let's say the Los Angeles Police Department, and you look at their ethnic breakdown, let's say back in 1990, and you would see that 60% of the LAPD back at that time was white, and only 3% of LAPD was Asian American. Well, if you go, let's say, move it up then to, let's say, 2015, the number of Asians have actually tripled, so that you have almost 10% of the LAPD is now Asian American. And the number of white officers has declined from about 60% down to about 30%. And right now, the largest number of LAPD officers are actually Latino, so that you have about 44-45% of LAPD actually being Latino. And it's a huge change. And now remember, this all occurred during the time of when Proposition 209 was in effect. What you had, therefore, was people who were made aware of employment opportunities in the LAPD. They got in based upon their merit, and so but that led to a natural changing of those numbers.
Yeah. That will be another topic which I think our viewers need to know a little bit more about, public contracting, because a lot of contracts go, and if we start having a quota system on contracts, I think the Indian entrepreneurs who contract with the state of California will be affected as well, because the number we have of Indian Americans is very small, and a lot of them are quite active, successful businessmen, and they may have to forego some of that business because state policies will not let, especially in the IT sector. Any contract with the government is vast majority Indian Americans, and they will definitely be affected by that. So we'll leave that for now, because I think we have limited time, as well as I think we rather have your expertise on education. So Mr. Izumi, I really want to thank you for coming here. This discussion was very helpful. I'm sure our members will learn a lot about this proposition and then benefit from your insights into it. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you very much. And, if any of your members have any follow-up questions, they can send them to you and you can forward them to me. I'd be happy to answer them for them.
Okay. We can always forward the questions to you, Mr. Izumi, and you can answer them. And if somebody wants to get in touch with you, we will get them in touch with you as well. So I will really appreciate your helping out some of our community members who have interest in community colleges and may be able to seek guidance from you. So you might hear from.
Let me just say, I'd be happy to continue to cooperate with any of the various groups on this call in the Indian American community, in the upcoming weeks and months. So,
okay.
Please feel free to call upon me. I'd be happy to.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Izumi. I think this will conclude our call, our meeting. So I hope rest of the members got to hear most of it. If not, it will be available in video format that can be viewed later also. Thank you so much. This concludes our meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.